Hi, everyone. Today we're going to get into Alexis de Tocqueville. Now, de Tocqueville is an interesting individual. He's a French diplomat, aristocrat, who comes to the United States in the middle part of the 19th century, the 1800s, to tour around and see what's happening in America, because he really sees America as being the future of the world and what does the future of Europe hold. So let's talk a little bit about him, add this as a supplement to our conversations about the religious revivals and all that sort of a thing that's taking place in the middle part of the 19th century. So Alexis de Tocqueville, he's a French aristocrat. He had visited the United States in 1831, and at the time, France was undergoing a lot of political upheaval. De Tocqueville wanted to understand why the democratic system seemed to work in America, but while in Europe, democracy was struggling, it just wasn't taking root the way that he and others thought that maybe it should. So he, along with his friend Gustave de Beaumont, come to the United States. And they travel across this young nation, observing its politics, culture, and dynamics. And just to give you a little bit more of a time frame here, 1831 was the presidency of Andrew Jackson. So it's during that time of expanding political participation, particularly among white male voters. Now, de Tocqueville's journey through America lasted for about 9 months. And during the time, he had met with politicians, he met with judges, ordinary citizens, and he traveled from New York to the Ohio River Valley. He went through portions of the South, and he also was on the frontier, which at that period of time would have been Louisiana Purchase, west of the Mississippi River and that sort of a thing. And while he was traveling, he gathered a vast array of observations that would form the basis of his masterpiece work, a book that he produced called Democracy in America. And it's a very important work looking at what was happening in the middle 19th century. Now, de Tocqueville's book was published in 2 volumes, one in 1835, the other was in 1840, and it covers a wide range of topics. But I want to focus on a few key themes that are central to understanding his views on American democracy and their relevance to the mid-19th century as far as America is concerned. So the first thing, let's talk about equality of conditions and individualism. There's about 5 key things that we'll touch on as we move through this. Sometimes they overlap a bit, but egalitarianism and individualism are 2 of those. Now, one of de Tocqueville's central observation was the equality of conditions in America. Now, unlike in Europe, there was a rigid class system in Europe. Aristocracy was deeply entrenched, but that's not happening in America. In America in the 1830s, it was relatively egalitarian society. This meant that while economic inequality still existed, and there's still going to be some race issues as well, quite a few of them, there was a sense of shared opportunity and individual effort. De Tocqueville argued that this equality of conditions created a sense of individualism in America, making them less dependent on traditional hierarchies and authorities. We are looking to fix our own problems and not seeking others to fix them for us. In other words, you go to Europe, you've got lords and ladies, and you've got aristocrats and big landowners and all that sort. We have those landowners here, but we're not looking at them to solve our problems. We are a very individualistic people, and this is something that de Tocqueville points out in his work. Now, de Tocqueville also is going to see the frontier as the great leveler. And this is very similar to what Frederick Jackson Turner will say in about 1890. In the West, settlers had to rely on themselves and their neighbors to survive. They built communities that way. They reinforced the spirit of self-reliance as well. And this individualism, as de Tocqueville warned, could lead Americans to withdraw into their own personal interest and neglected the larger needs of society. But he also saw this individualism as a source of energy and of innovation, and that would help to drive the country forward as well. So there's pluses and there's minuses to it. I kind of see it as far as he's concerned. He sees the minuses sort of outweighed by the pluses. But you got to be careful. And today as well. What about religion and civic association? Something else that he addressed. Tocqueville was fascinated with the role of religion and civic associations in American life. He observed that, unlike Europeans, where religion was often associated with the state and political power in America, religion was largely a private matter. We have separation of church and state. Although it doesn't appear in the Constitution at all, the idea of keeping the government out of the church was what this was about. Not to keep the church out of government, it was to keep the government out of the church. But this separation of church and state that we have here is not something they had in Europe. Look at England at the time, even today. The king or queen is the head of the Church of England, the Anglican Church. But here we keep the two as separate as is possible in a free society. He argued that the separation of church and state would allow religion to thrive without being corrupted by politics. And he believed that religion played an essential role in maintaining a moral social order and guiding the democratic process. So in other words, he's viewing a very religious society in the 1830s. Now, moreover, de Tocqueville is also going to see civic associations, local organizations where civilians could come together to solve common problems as a cornerstone of American democracy. And these voluntary groups range from temperance societies to charitable organizations to help out the poor. They help to prevent the government from becoming too powerful. It forced a sense of shared responsibility, and we're not relying on the government to help us. We're relying on our fellow human beings to help us within society. And those with means are becoming more and more involved in these types of these associations. De Tocqueville believed that these associations were critical to helping with preserving liberty. It's a critical element in that preservation. Now, he also mentions the tyranny of the majority. Now, one of de Tocqueville's most famous and enduring concepts is the tyranny of the majority. We've heard some of the founding fathers discuss this term as well, but it kind of gets put onto paper here. He warned that in a democratic society where the will of the majority rules, there's a danger that the rights of the minority or groups or individuals could be trampled. De Tocqueville believed that the majority, while very powerful, could become oppressive, especially if it was remained unchecked by laws or principles that protected individual rights. So, in de Tocqueville's view, democracy needed strong institutions like courts and a free press to protect minorities from the potential abuses of majority rule. He believed that without these safeguards, American democracy could fall victim to the passions and prejudices of the majority, leading to unjust outcomes. So in other words, he's talking about that sort of mob mentality, that democracy is mob rule kind of thing. What the founding fathers had warned about, and that was very much the topic of conversation during the term of Jackson. Remember, this would have been talked about. Who is he talking to? Politicians, judges, individuals as he crosses the nation. So I'm sure he's reflecting some of the thoughts that individual Americans are having as well, and he's drawing his own conclusions from that. Now, what's the relevance here? So how does Tocqueville's analysis of American democracy apply to the mid-19th century? Well, let's put this into context. By the time that Tocqueville's second volume was published in 1840, Andrew Jackson's presidency was over. But it had transformed American politics. It had ushered in what we call the Age of Jackson. Jackson democracy, or Jacksonian democracy, emphasized the common man, of individual rights, of westward expansion, all of which aligned with Tocqueville's observations of individualism and the egalitarian spirit of the frontier. But Tocqueville's warnings about the tyranny of the majority were becoming increasingly relevant. Debates over slavery were heating up. The Southern minority, which only accounted for about 9 million of a population, with a northern population of 22 million. So the South is obviously the minority in this conversation. The South's minority interests are increasingly at odds with the northern majority. De Tocqueville's insights in the fragility of democracy and the risk of majoritarian rule foreshadowed the deep divides that would lead to the Civil War. Now, going back to those numbers I just gave you, those are the numbers in 1860. So, they're slightly skewed and slightly less when we're in the 1830s, but the ratio remains pretty much the same. So, what about the legacy of de Tocqueville? Now, Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America remains one of the most insightful analyses of American politics, of American society, and of culture as well. His observations about individualism, religion, civic participation, the dangers of majority rule continue to resonate today. We can look at our historical past, and we can sort of see what we've been through. Are we going through it again? I once heard a historian tell me that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And so we see that from time to time. So these questions, liberty, equality, democracy, that de Tocqueville first raised 200 years ago, we need to keep those questions in mind because, again, history goes through cycles. So thank you for joining me today as we explored de Tocqueville. He's an interesting individual. But his insights into democracy are going to be very valuable, especially in America. What's he looking at? He's looking at this mainly to find out what needs to happen in Europe to bring us on level with the United States. But he also is going to point out some problems that maybe Americans need to solve. And this is, again, going to be fairly widely read when it's published in 1835 and then again in the second volume in 1840. So thank you for joining me today as we explore this individual. And I hope this has been helpful. It's not something that I talked about deeply in my Chapter 10 video, but I feel like it's something that we need to revisit. And so we've revisited it on an individual format, an individual video. So come back and see me. Hit the like button if it's been helpful, and I will see you down the road. Bye-bye.